Tonight we're in the great cathedral city of Lincoln, and welcome to Question Time. Good evening, whether you're watching at home, listening at home, here in the audience. Welcome to you and to our panel, of course. Tonight, the Conservative Defence Minister, Anna Soubry, Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, Douglas Alexander, the newly elected President of the Liberal Democrats, Sal Brinton, the Political Director of the Huffington Post UK, Mehdi Hasan, and the historian, David Starkey. And just before we take the first question, remember, you can intervene in the debate from home in various ways. Our hashtag is BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time. You can text comments to 83981. You can use the red button to see what others are saying. All the details are there on the screen. But our first question tonight comes from Hamid Bukhari, please.
Free speech is good, but where do you draw the line before it becomes harmful and offensive?
Mehdi Hasan.
It's a very good question. It's obviously in light of last week's horrendous massacre in France. Look, as a Muslim, and the Muslims have been at the centre of this debate for the past week, sadly, once again, as a Muslim, I'm not going to pretend that depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in a very racialised, sexualised, even terroristic way don't offend me. Clearly they do. Why wouldn't they? But as a Muslim, I also have to say, what offends me, what outrages me much, much more is the spilling of innocent blood in the name of Islam, in the name of my religion. And in the name of my Prophet. I mean, Prophet Muhammad was someone who later on in his life, when he returned to Mecca in triumph, he forgave all the people in that city who had physically assaulted and verbally abused him early on in his life. That's my Prophet. The Quran says that if someone insults your religion, your God, you move away from them. You sit away from them. You don't kill them. In fact, the Quran says that if you kill one innocent person, it's the equivalent of killing the entire human race. So last week's attack was not just an attack on journalists, on innocent French Jews going about their business. It was an attack on all of us. It was an attack on humanity, and it was an attack on Islam. On the specific question of free speech, we have had this rather one-sided debate since last week. I know you touched on it in last week's show as well. And Vince Cable made the point last week that we do have limits on free speech. Some people have been acting over the last week as if there is an absolute untrammeled right to say whatever you like, whenever you like. That's not true. There are legal limits and there are moral limits. Forget things we ban. There are things we just don't say out of taste, out of decency. Sorry to be crude, but you have the right to fart in a crowded lift. You just don't do it, though, do you? And when you do it, and if somebody attacks you for it, that attack is outrageous, but you don't expect everybody else in the lift to fart in solidarity with you. So I just... And that's, again, that is not to take away from what happened last week. Nothing excuses what happens. I'm sure there's some dunderhead on Twitter right now saying, I'm a victim blamer. No, there is no excuse for what happened last week. No matter how provocative or hateful you are, nobody can come and take your life in response. What I am saying is that we have to have this debate in a mature way. There are limits, and a lot of Muslims, if we're going to talk about Muslims, are very upset over the last week. Any Muslim watching this show will know, have been having the same conversations in private, not in public, won't say it in public, but about the double standards. There do seem to be the double standards that you can say whatever you like about Islam or the Prophet in the name of free speech, but when other communities and other religions are hurt, suddenly you can't do it. Suddenly there are limits, and that applies to the Danish... One last point, David. The Danish cartoons, which started this off in 2006, they published those cartoons of the Prophet. Did you know that 3 years earlier they were given cartoons mocking Jesus and the resurrection, and the editor said, I won't publish them because they'll provoke an outrage. But outraging Muslims, that's fine. But he wouldn't do it with Jesus. All I'm saying is, let's be consistent one way or the other.
You've been going on a very long time.
I'm sure
Did you look at the last Christmas private eye for mocking Jesus, for mocking Mary, for doing it brilliantly, crudely, coarsely, cleverly? The idea...
Well, the private eye is not the equivalent, David, as you know, of Charlie Hebdo.
Sorry, but you said that there's discrimination against Muslims. This seems to me...
I'm saying... No,
hang on a second.
I'm saying people use free speech as a cover for saying...
Let's just go back to the question. David Starkey.
I'm just saying it's rubbish.
David Starkey, the question that Hamid...
It's not rubbish. I give you a factual example, so it's
just
by
wait.
definition not rubbish.
Hamid Bukhari said, free speech is good, but where do you draw the line before it becomes harmful and offensive? What's your answer to his question?
You draw it, as it were, as narrowly as possible. Free speech is the foundation of and freedom of thought is the foundation of what we are. It is why in the last 400 or 500 years, this tiny little speck of earth called Europe has transformed the world, rethought humanity. And the lack of it, I'm afraid, is why Islam is now primitive and backward after having been glorious. The early days of Islam, when Islam had conquered most of the Roman Empire, when it was dealing with people with the inheritance of Greece, with the inheritance of the Chaldees, with the inheritance of India, Islam was the center of the intellectual universe because it was open, it was diverse, it was welcoming, it accepted challenge. The moment Islam turned on itself, forgot freedom of thought and freedom of speech, it is dying. Nothing has been written in Arabic that matters for at least the last 5 centuries.
But saving the history lesson for a moment.
No, because the history lesson...
The question...
I said draw the limits as narrowly as possible. Because
all right, well, where would you draw them?
As narrowly as possible.
But that's easy to say. What do you mean by it?
Well, I think the word narrow has got a very clear limit.
Well, should Charlie Hebdo have published the cartoon in the way they did?
Of course. Religion has got no privilege whatever. We heard the Pope today saying that religion is specially privileged. This is nonsense. Why? The idea that because you feel strongly about something means that nobody must challenge you is an absurdity. People feel very strongly about stupid things and they hate being challenged. We've heard that already. Now, again, I'm going to step right out of line here. I'm sure we will hear from Ahmed. In France, there are very strict rules, as there are in most of continental Europe, that you cannot say that the Holocaust did not happen, called Holocaust denial. I would repeal that law completely. It is totally unnecessary. We had a wonderful example we had a wonderful example of a man called David Irving, who was a great Holocaust denier. He was sent to jail in Austria. That made him a martyr. When he sued a publisher who had published a book which said that he was a liar and a fool, he was taken to pieces by freedom of speech, by my colleague Richard Evans, who shredded him in a way that no law could. Freedom of speech is us.
Anna Soubry.
I think there's a bit of a phony argument going on between the two of you, actually. I have to say, I agree with everything that Mehdi said, and I think he said it beautifully and brilliantly, and I'm delighted everybody applauded. No, he didn't lie.
I lied.
You lied.
You were on record. Hang on, you've spoken for a long time. Can someone else speak?
Sorry,
isn't that free speech, allowing somebody else to have a point of view?
You were on record when you were not speaking to an audience like... No, I am going to say it.
Please do.
You were on record as saying to an audience of Muslims that kufirs are cattle and animals.
Where are
no.
Sorry, I thought
he said that.
David,
in other words,
given you can't get my name right, my name is Mehdi, not Ahmed, I would question your selective quotation of something I said a decade ago.
It's not
all right, David, leave it for a moment.
No.
David, leave it, please. You're not the only person on this panel, as you well know.
And also, no, David, sorry. I'm not going to take lessons from a man who blamed the London riots on black culture and blames sex crimes on Pakistani culture and now blames terrorism on Islam. I'm not going to take lessons in offence or politeness. You're basically Katie Hopkins with a PhD. You just troll for a living.
I take it back, actually, because I was trying to put some oil on some waters that I didn't think were too trouble. But actually, David, I think you've completely blew it because you're talking complete rubbish. And I go back to where I came, try and put some sense into to all of this. Look, it's absolutely right that we should all believe in free speech. We are very proud of it in this country, but sometimes within free speech there will be offence. I mean, people say things about all of us, especially politicians, which are, you know, frankly pretty offensive. But I would not deny somebody the right to say it. I may not agree with it, I might be offended by it, but there is certainly in law there is an absolute line, and it's a line that should not be crossed, which is why we make it illegal. And that's when something is said or done that actually incites hatred. And that line, I think we've got it right in our law, and it's good when people are prosecuted for it. But if you have any sort of view, there are times you are going to be offended, and you take it on the chin. It's part of the brilliance of our society. It's what gives us our democracy and ensures we have the freedoms we enjoy. So we shouldn't be afraid of being offended.
And briefly, should Muslims therefore not be offended, in your view, by the Charlie Hebdo cartoons?
No, that's not for me to say. If somebody
you said people should not be offended.
No, I didn't. I say one can take offence at all sorts of things. And if a Muslim takes offence at the depiction of their prophet, that is for them to do. Yeah. There are some Christians who will no doubt... God, I'm old enough to remember Mary Whitehouse, and many of us are, and the prosecution that she took because there was a play that depicted Jesus as being gay. I mean, we look back on let's be honest, we look back on these things now, we can't really believe it. I think most people would shrug their shoulders, but some people will be offended, and that's part of free speech.
Let me have one or two members of the audience. I'll come to the members of the panel in a moment. You, sir.
Thank you, yes. Well, with rights go responsibilities, and whilst there may be the right for Charlie Hebdo to offend, they didn't necessarily need and perhaps had the responsibility not to be offensive in the way they were this week. I felt that they were gratuitously provocative and will upset the moderate Muslim community. And I just don't understand the need for the public.
That's a good point.
Yes, I'm going back to what David Starkey said, is that I couldn't disagree more by saying that, you know, the Muslims aren't civilised anymore. There are plenty of Muslims that live in modern-day society that integrate perfectly, and you're basing your views on a handful of extremists that commit atrocities.
Douglas Alexander.
You read the news.
Douglas Alexander.
You read the news.
Douglas
Can I say, as David was talking, my mind turned to that police officer who was assassinated in Paris last week, who was a Muslim, who died trying to defend people of one faith, another faith, of no faith. My mind turned back to that young Muslim in the kosher supermarket who hid Jews who were trying to be killed by these violent extremists. Now, the reason that point is relevant to this question is I think David Starkey talks a lot of offensive nonsense about 1.6 billion Muslims around the world. But in a free society, I defend his right to say it. And actually, taking offence cannot ever be a justification for the kind of violence, terrorism and gratuitous murder that we saw last week on the streets of Paris. And in a pluralist society, we are going to bump into each other. People of the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, the Muslim faith, or of no faith, all have a stake in free speech. In Britain in the 21st century, we have the right to freedom of worship, but also the right to freedom of expression. And both of those matter. And in that sense, of course, people need to exercise that right with responsibility, but there is an absolute obligation to uphold the law and not have a situation where assassins and terrorists somehow have a veto on what we write, what we draw, or what we think.
Brinton.
Voltaire said, and I think Douglas paraphrased him, that I disagree strongly with what you've said, but I will stand to the death to allow you to say it. And France is fiercely secular and has been since the Revolution. And Charlie Hebdo is not Private Eye. It will be very interesting when it's published in English tomorrow to see what our reaction is to it, because I think many people in this country will also be offended by it. But that is all right. It is the point at which it incites others to do harm that there's a problem. And actually, in the last couple of days, Dieudonné, the French comedian, has been arrested because he has been wearing a sign saying, "Je suis Colabier," one of the terrorists who was killed. And that was clearly seen as supporting the terrorists and trying to incite other people to take action. That, the original questioner asked, where's the line? That's the line. When you incite people to do things that harm others, and obviously the deaths last week were a prime example of that, but there are others too, and we've seen them in this country too, in marches by the English Defence League that have been called off, real worries about public order and public security. That's the line we've got to follow.
I'd just like to go back to the. I'd like to go back to the questioner, Hamid Bukhari. Does that answer? What's your opinion of this, and who do you agree with on the panel?
Except David, I will say I will agree with the rest of the panel. I think probably no one is surprised about it. I especially agree with Mehdi. Really, what happened in Paris was really bad. Free speech is good, but I think I found Charlie Hebdo much more offensive. I think it was not a free speech, it was more offensive in targeting Islam and targeting Muhammad. I think that was very offensive rather than a free speech, I will say.
Okay. And you sat there on the right.
I want to know why we give the terrorists so much publicity.
Hear, hear.
Why are we doing that? Jerry Adams, for instance, wasn't allowed to speak in public, or none of his conversations were recorded for years. And, you know, we should put a blanket over any activity to actually promote themselves. You know, they've got what they wanted. We've put them in the press, we've named them, you know, and we shouldn't be doing that. You know, we should be actually protecting ourselves from these terrorists. Obviously...
Sir, I would normally, I have to say, looking at past terrorist acts, I would agree with you in past terrorist groups. But I think what we're seeing with these men, they are normally men, but what we're seeing is a type of terrorist that we've never seen before at any time, certainly in our lifetime. These are people who are prepared to kill themselves, who see no distinction between a child and an adult, and actually see no distinction between a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim. So they are beyond reason. But normally I would agree with you about the oxygen of publicity. These guys I don't think they even want publicity.
Oh, of course,
I think they're deranged.
Look at that's absolute rubbish. Of course, it's all about publicity.
No, what I mean is, I just don't think that's not the same as some of the other terrorists we've seen. I think
someone who sits with a rifle on a wall.
I agree with you that they're much worse than anything that came before. But
someone who sits with a rifle on a wall and makes a videotape, categorically, before any action's taken, is clearly making a public announcement. And that was played on TV. Right. We shouldn't be playing that. Okay. That's all I'm saying.
Good point.
I think he's right. I think the gentleman is right to an extent. Terrorism has always been about the propaganda of the deed, and the way you beat terrorism is to refuse to be terrorised and not give them the publicity they want. Just on the context of free speech in France, we hear a lot about France in the last few days being this champion of liberty and free speech, and this is what I talked about earlier about some of the double standards. It's just not true. In 2005, you know, David wants some facts. In 2005, a court in France banned a fashion company from using a picture of the Last Supper because it was a gratuitous insult to people's most innermost beliefs. Sarkozy, who's been running around the media in the last few days, he took rappers to court for insulting the French Republic when he was an interior minister. You know, everyone has their own lines. People draw them in different places and then pretend to be champions of free speech, and everyone else doesn't believe in free speech. Right. It's just not...
Let me try and answer the gentleman's question. I think that there is a difference between censoring any words that are heard from people who claim to be terrorists. That was tried in Britain in the past, if you remember, with the IRA, Margaret Thatcher saying we need to deny them the oxygen of publicity. I don't believe that that ultimately can succeed in the 21st century, but I do think where you are right, for example, is these heinous, appalling ISIS videos that are released from Syria and elsewhere. The point that they are... I mean, I absolutely disagree that they don't want publicity. The point of terrorism is to terrorise. I think the way that, as a civilised society, we should respond to that is not to try and close down every channel of communication, but to have resilience, to show unity rather than to succumb to division, to say we are going to carry on with our lives, we're going to live and let live. And in that sense, that is the way, as I think the Parisian population showed brilliantly at the weekend, we can most effectively counter the hateful message of division and ideology that we're getting out of these kind of terrorists at the moment.
And David Starkey, briefly if you would, because I want to go on to another question. I'll come to you.
I think we've got to remember, and this is very much to your point about why we should know, we are living through a huge convulsion in one of the most important world religions. Islam is 600 years younger than Christianity. In Islamic time, it's 1400. Islam is probably on the verge of a reformation. It's in the middle of a war of religion. The great bulk of the victims of Islamic terrorism are fellow Muslims. That is why we need to know. And it's not an isolated function of Western society. It's not a function of our invasions of the Middle East, places like Nigeria, where there's been no invasion at all. It's there. We need to know about this. This is one of the central facts that we're going through now. We're a sideshow.
Well, that's convenient that you're a sideshow. No, there's no responsibility at all in foreign policy in the Muslim world. There's no wars going on.
I said we in Britain are... The events in Britain and France, compared with the convulsions in the Middle East, are a sideshow. There is, of course, a very distinguished Muslim leader.
We're deeply involved in the Middle East, David.
The president of Egypt, Sisi, or Sisi, or however he pronounces his name.
Military dictator we support.
Sisi.
Sisi, thank you very much.
All right.
No, just one second. He said that Islam is undergoing this crisis.
David, he locks up Al Jazeera journalists without trial for over a year, and he's supported by our government. So please don't tell me that we're not intimately involved in repressing free speech in the Middle East.
All right, let's leave it. That's not going to go anywhere. And I noticed you didn't mention Nigeria, which is where much worse things are happening. But
or Turkey, or everywhere in the Middle East.
We don't cover African deaths, do we?
Or everywhere in the Middle East.
But things have been reported.
Sorry.
Wait, we're going to go on to one of the consequences of all this. Just before we do, come and join Question Time. We're going to be in Eastleigh in Hampshire next week, Wrexham the week after, and the details are there on the screen. So if you'd like to take part in this, Eastleigh next week, Wrexham the week after. I want to take this question from Della Stone, if I may. Della Stone, please.
Should the security forces have full access to telephone and messaging records if it helps to identify terrorists?
A subject which has become very hot at the moment for obvious reasons. Sal Brinton.
I don't believe that they should. There's already clear evidence to show that if you support, and we have been through the coalition government, providing more support for the security services where they believe that there are terrorists or criminals actually engaging in things, that's fine. But we're back to this issue about freedom, and in this country, our personal freedom for privacy has been very, very well liked and respected. The problem with what is proposed by the Conservatives, and in particular by David Cameron, is that it won't actually work. The first thing that will happen is we have to make sure that we can have access to records held by international companies not based here in the UK. And in America, they won't provide it back. Secondly, there's some real worries about how many people will be taken to trawl through those things. Now, at present, if the security services or the police have any suspicions, they can get court orders, they can get access to those records. But to hold the data of every single person in this room, every single person in this country, to be able to access your web browsing history and be able to track that back is a step too far, and I believe it's a real infringement on our personal liberties. That is not to say we shouldn't help the security services when they are actually investigating people.
So your objection... Your objections are both practical and objections of principle. Anna Soubry.
Look, I've got a lot of time for my Lib Dem colleagues in the coalition, but on this one, they are absolutely wrong.
I thought you were just going...
No, actually, I have a lot of time for a number of Lib Dem ministers that I've enjoyed working with. But on this one, not only are you wrong in principle, but you're wrong in fact. Forgive me, but the question said telephone messages. For a very long time, if the police suspected somebody of criminal activity, classically drug dealing, then the police have the power to be able not only to request your records from your mobile telephone company, but actually to delve into your records, to discover the texts. Please let me just finish, because I just think there's so much ignorance on this. They can delve into your records. They can discover not only when you texted this other person, but what the content of your texts were. They can go into your records because the companies have to keep them, so they can pinpoint when you used your mobile telephone and in what place. And they've had that power for years.
So
this is just an extension into the internet. We have nothing to fear.
Absolutely.
It's not about snooping.
An extension to social media of all kinds?
No, but it's asking the companies to retain the information, not necessarily even the content, but the fact that person A has sent an email to person B, not even the content of it, but there has been communication.
All right.
There's a lot of, nonsense talked, and we need to get the facts out. You have nothing to fear.
Where I agree with you is there is a lot of nonsense being talked on this issue. What we're witnessing is a totally concocted row that is self-serving both for Liberal Democrats and for Conservatives. And frankly, this is an issue that is far, far too serious to be the subject of playing politics within the coalition.
We're not.
What are the, just let me answer the question. What are the facts?
That's just not fair.
It is absolutely fair, and let me explain why.
I hold a genuine view.
It's concocted.
It's just not fair. It doesn't advance the argument.
Let me explain why, Anna. It is concocted. When Nick Clegg goes on the radio yesterday morning and says the security services will be looking at the records of grandmothers visiting garden centres, he's talking nonsense. Why is he talking nonsense? Yes. Because actually he wasn't even able to defend that proposition. There's several truths that need to be heard by the British public. Firstly, it is true that the intelligence services do extraordinary work on our behalf every single day, and we are safer as a result of their efforts rather than less safe. The second truth is there are new capabilities now in the hands of terrorists that simply weren't there a few years ago. They've moved from telephony to the internet. There are new apps which allow encryption. So actually there are parts of the internet that are becoming dark to the security services that weren't the case even a few years ago. So what is the right response, I think, for any responsible government? It is not to rush to say, here's a blank cheque to the security services, or to pretend that actually they have anything other than our interests at heart in keeping us safe. The right response is to give them both new powers and to have new oversight over what the intelligence agencies are doing. Now, the truth is, last July, when the government came to the House of Commons with emergency legislation, we as the Labour Party said that we would support it on this condition, that there should be a proper review by David Anderson, the Terrorism Commissioner, completely separate from politics, looking at exactly what the balance should be of the new powers the intelligence agencies need and the new supervision that we would all reasonably expect in terms of ministerial warrants, parliamentary scrutiny. Now, the fact is that report is due within a few months, so we don't need an argy-bargy within the coalition. We need serious people to be allowed to do serious work, then to put it before the House of Commons so that we get that balance right, that keeps us safe but also protects the civil liberties that is the foundation of a democratic society. Frankly, we deserve better than this self-serving, concocted nonsense from the coalition.
Why do you say self-serving?
What's your answer to this
self-serving stuff?
The allegation about the self-serving thing is ridiculous.
You signed up to the review. It's due in a couple of months.
And actually, the counter-terrorism bill that is going through Parliament at the moment already has much of the recommendations of David Anderson QC. The Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives support that. There's one or two things in there that we don't, but actually the main recommendation...
Had the review yet. It's due in a couple of months.
Well, on this
Let's
one,
leave the
honestly,
parliamentary point. I come to the lady in the front here.
Be concerned about it.
Yes.
Omitting the element of frivolous or salacious journalism, isn't this a very fine line between terrorism investigation and what we've just been heard described and hacking?
No, because you would have to have a suspicion, obviously, and be it the police or the security services. There's ministerial warrants that have to be applied for. There's always, of course, the warrants that police, in any event, go to judges for. All these checks and balances are there. And it's not to pry on what the content even is. It's just to make sure that we know who's talking to who, only when they're under suspicion.
You've said that once already. Let's hear from people who might have views of their own about it in the audience. You, sir, with your hand up there. Yes.
He says that the information that these powers will be able to give the intelligence communities to obtain to help them, the intelligence services knew and were looking to recruit the individuals who slaughtered Lee Rigby, and they still didn't do anything about that. So why do we need... The intelligence services know they have people, know they have assets,
Mehdi Hasan,
and don't do anything about it. So what is this actually going to help?
Mehdi Hasan, and then I'll come to you.
It's a very good point. And I mean, I just find it astonishing that every time, let's go back in your memory, there's a terrorist atrocity, our political leaders, whether Labour or Tory, they come on television, they come on radio, and they say, this is an attack on our freedom, this is an attack on our way of life. And then a few days later, the very same politicians come back on TV and say, the only way to defeat those terrorists is to reduce our freedom and change our way of life, which seems to me utterly bizarre, utterly self-defeating and self-destructive. And I think the gentleman makes a very important point. The question asked about helping identify these terrorists. And look, the terrorists in Paris, these guys, they weren't kind of unknowns. They were on the intelligence services radar. They were on the watch lists. They were on the no-fly lists. They had criminal convictions, as did the Lee Rigby killers, as did the 7/7 bombers were on the radar, the 9/11 attackers. And I think the answer to intelligence failures isn't just to do what David Cameron does, which is whatever you need, we'll give you, especially when they already have a lot of powers already. Powers which, if anyone follows the Edward Snowden revelations, knows have been abused. And I think the real issue for us is think about the principle behind those. We just had an argument about free speech. If you know that the state, government, can read your emails, access your most private thoughts, how does that help you develop your free speech? Won't you start restraining what you say in private as well as public if you know Big Brother is watching?
The woman up there. Yes, you.
They can have all my records, I don't do out dodgy.
Can I just...
They can have all your records. All right.
Can I just...
Let's ask every government minister if they agree to that.
I'm going again to break records by saying I agree absolutely with Douglas Alexander. We've got to ask a very we've got to ask a fundamental question here. The web was created by Tim Berners-Lee on the grounds of a belief in essential human goodness. That is how it was created. That is why it was done. Now, anybody knows that the notion of essential human goodness is stupid. Rousseau is wrong, and I'm afraid...
Well, if they've met you, they probably would think that. Yes.
Hobbes is right.
Couldn't resist.
Life is nasty, brutish and short. And the web operates in secret ways which deliberately help criminals, which deliberately help drug dealers, which deliberately help terrorists. And this has to be confronted. It's not freedom... Normally, I am a passionate libertarian. I've made that point absolutely clear. But these are people operating by anonymity. The terrible thing about the web is people say vile things without their names.
But David, one of the problems with your argument is that people who understand about the web are now moving to the dark web. In the same way that most of us with young teenage children... So you can't. The point about the dark web is they will find ways around it.
But then at least can we have the powers to do that? But the whole business of encryption, there are very good reasons why access to encryption should be jealously guarded.
But are you saying it's physically possible or impossible to patrol the web in this way?
I think that we should start doing so. But the web, can I just put it really simply? Why should the web be the only area of our lives that isn't actually seriously subject to law?
That is very true.
Why not? That's a different argument.
It is the argument. It is the argument. You're right. You're absolutely right.
Vast areas of people where people can communicate other than the web. So if you start controlling that, how far does it go? People can send letters, they're not checked by anybody. People can go to McDonald's and talk to each other, people can go anywhere.
But can I just...
It'll just carry on and on and on.
But the thing is, at the moment, the law allows, if the suspicion is there, for somebody to be able to read, Mehdi, your text if you're under suspicion. So if the law allows you to read your text...
If you're under suspicion
then
is the
why
key
not,
criteria, not a blanket access to every citizen.
Mehdi, you're not letting me finish. Because you have to go to a judge, you have to get a warrant to do these things. All we are now asking is for the extension to carry on, so that not even the content of the email, but the connection. There must be no hiding place.
You said that. But Mehdi, what do you say to the lady up there who said, you can read my emails, I have nothing to worry about at all. You can read anything.
And I'm greatly admiring of you, but I suspect that pretty much everyone in this room, including every minister and politician, will be the last person to say, come and read all our emails and texts and phone calls. Privacy is a fundamental right, as much a fundamental right as free speech. That's not...
Up there. There's a woman there I go to at the back. In the back row, please. Yes. Yes, you in the red.
The thing is, the police force, if they're going to try and look into your internet to see what's happened. The police force has been slashed, the budget, and there's more cuts still to come. So what are we going to do? Who's going to keep us safe and our children? Because the cybercrime, the paedophiles, they're all out there, and there's less and less people to actually be able to find them and stop them.
OK. And the man in front of you there. Yes, you.
The point was made that these people are on the radar already, so the digital and phone surveillance obviously works to a certain extent. Would it not be a better idea to divert more money into actual manpower so we can get people on the ground to follow these people?
There is another on the warrant issue, David. On the warrant issue, Anna mentioned the warrant issue. I mean, come on, maybe I'm the only person on this panel who thinks it's being a little bit naive here. I do respect, as Douglas says, the work of the intelligence services, but let's look at how anti-terror powers have been abused as well. Doreen Lawrence was spied on by the Met. Town councils have used anti-terror powers to spy on parents to see where they live and check their schools are in the right catchment areas. We know what's happened with illegal renditions and what MI6 and MI5 have been involved in. No, we can't just say give the intelligence what they want and trust them to do the right thing in a democracy.
Nobody is saying that.
You just said they'll get warrants. All I'm saying is the NSA...
No, we're talking about the checks and balances there, but there is another important point.
The checks and balances?
The gentleman over there in the middle made a very important point when he talked about Facebook, and one of the things that we also need to do is to make sure that all the social media people who haven't been acting in a responsible way, they too act in a responsible way. They have a duty to monitor.
ISIS has depended on the social media. You know, the Islamic terrorism is this astonishing combination of medievalism on the one hand and utter modernity on the other. This weird combination of the two. We need to recognise it.
You in the fourth row, and then I'll go to the question, and then we'll go on to another question. Yes?
I think what this comes down to for a lot of people is a question of if I'm doing nothing wrong, I've got nothing to hide, but I've got nothing to lose. But they seem to forget that they do have a lot to lose, and it's called your basic rights and your liberty.
And, all right, and the woman who asked the question, can I go back to you? What do you think?
Well, I understand that Theresa May actually said this was only going to be done in extremis, so I presume that they have a reason to do what they're going to do. And if it keeps us safe, then why not?
You're happy.
I'm quite happy.
All right, well, thank you very much. We'll go on now to another question because we are over halfway through the programme. Sarah Alexander, please.
Can a 44-year-old teacher be groomed by a 16-year-old pupil?
This was the decision of the judge, Joanna Green.
She's sentencing, yeah.
When sentencing, yes, Stuart Kerner gave him a suspended sentence. He's a 44-year-old school teacher because the person he was alleged to have, or he was found guilty of having had sex with, was 16 years old, and she said he had been groomed by her.
She actually said, because I read the sentencing remarks, he'd been convicted after a trial because he always denied it. So I am surprised the sentence was suspended in those circumstances, if I may say. And actually, when you read what she said, she said, if anything, she groomed you.
Yes.
So I only put that in so that we see it in the context. But she shouldn't have said that because you're absolutely right. It's inconceivable for a 16-year-old to groom a 44-year-old married man. He willingly did what he did. Now, whether in all the circumstances, and this is always a problem that we have, because we've not been the jury, we've not been the judge, we've not heard all the facts, but certainly on what I have read, I have to say, I thought it was the sort of case, I used to be an old criminal barrister, blah, blah. I was surprised that the sentence was suspended, particularly because he'd had a trial, and therefore he'd put this young woman through the ordeal of a trial. And when people don't put their hands up and admit what they've done wrong, your sympathy levels quite properly drop. I was surprised. I think the Attorney-General is doing the right thing by looking at the sort of offences which he can then take to the Court of Appeal.
They're saying they can't take this.
And they can't take this one.
Yes, all right.
Well, category.
Yes, all right. But the issue is I think, the moral one. Douglas Alexander.
Well, like Anna, I was a lawyer before I became a Member of Parliament. Just let me finish the sentence. Yes, moving from one popular profession to another.
Yes.
And she's right. We haven't seen all of the evidence. We weren't there in court. So I'm not the kind of politician who normally takes pot shots at judges. But as a parent, I was disgusted by this ruling. Absolutely disgusted. I send my daughter to school every day, and I have a reasonable expectation and right to expect that my daughter will be safe at school. And there is a basic truth about schools, which is the adults are the teachers. And we're talking about a 16-year-old girl and a 44-year-old man.
Married man.
To me, it is pretty obvious who is the adult in that circumstance. Now, personally, I thought we'd left these kind of attitudes behind. It is, to my mind, just sickening to suggest that somehow, if he was in a fragile mental state, if he's in a fragile mental state, he shouldn't be teaching children, or he should go to the head teacher.
Absolutely.
Teachers are encountering these kind of situations reasonably regularly during their professional life. All teachers know what is the right and responsible course of action. If they aren't able to deal with it themselves, they go to the head teacher, but they must never forget that they are in a position of unique responsibility with our children. This man clearly forgot that responsibility, and I find it incredulous that with the Judicial Studies Board and everything else, a judge in the 21st century could utter those words.
Right. There's a woman there. You.
Whilst I understand that she was 16 and vulnerable, she consented to what happened. What about victims of rape at the hands of their boyfriends or husbands who miss out on the chance of justice? That the system is failing those people who genuinely do not consent to sex or any kind of sexual advances.
David Starkey.
Obviously, Douglas is right. The teacher behaved disgracefully. But the other side of the story is more important. With the proper concern about the seduction of children, the abuse of children, I think we're beginning now absolutely to become Victorian. We're starting to idealise childhood. We're starting to say, in a sense, suddenly there is this magic moment at the age of consent when you become fully sexual and fully adult. In fact, it's a very long and complex process. A girl of 16...
You've missed the point. You've missed the point totally. And Douglas got the point completely. It's about the abuse of power. It's about the trust.
Sorry, you shut up. You're very good at saying the obvious.
No, I know what the law is. I know what the offence is, and it was because of the abuse of trust and power. It's a specific offence to stop people doing this.
We were asked a question about the behaviour of the child. No. I am trying to answer the question on the behaviour of the child. I am saying I have seen 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys and girls that were highly mature sexually, that were profoundly manipulative and knew exactly what they wanted. For an adult, to surrender to it is wrong. We're not denying that. But can we stop idealising children? Haven't you read Freud?
Absolute rubbish.
All right, stop abusing each other.
I'm sorry, but no,
the question was, can a 44-year-old teacher be groomed by a 16-year-old schoolgirl? No. And David Starkey is saying yes.
Well, he's wrong.
It's possible. What do you think?
He's wrong.
He can be... Wait, can we replace the word groomed by seduced?
No, because there's a difference.
No, shall we
have... The man who cares about words, my God, you don't half abuse them on this programme. There's a profound difference.
Sorry. And a judge listened to this carefully, clearly. As far as I can see the case, she set him up. She excited him. She did. He was wrong. He was wrong to respond.
He was a 44-year-old man.
I know, but he's wrong to respond.
David, I've been a probation officer for 23 years. I've worked with hundreds of sex offenders. It helps absolutely no one to blur the boundaries between childhood and adulthood. Responsibility lies absolutely with the adult, and the statements by yourself and by the judge in this case feeds into the distorted views that sex offenders
absolutely right.
It's merely a recognition of reality.
No, it is.
Mehdi Hasan.
Look, I totally agree with what Douglas was saying earlier. I'm the father of 2 girls. When you leave your children at school, I mean, apart from the parents, where do children spend most time with teachers? And you expect trust, you expect responsibility, and this guy clearly abused both trust and responsibility. And the phrase used was grooming by the judge. And, you know, outrageous remarks by the judge. I mean, we expect outrageous remarks from David Starkey, but from a judge, a female judge, basically victim blaming. She didn't just talk about grooming, she talked about stalking, she talked about obsession, and she made
all the things I've been talking about, and she heard the evidence.
She made this one remark. She said to this teacher, she said, if she hadn't been obsessed with you, this wouldn't have happened, which is totally wrong, because it wouldn't have happened had he said no, 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 gone to the head teacher and said, can you put her in a different class, rather than have sex with her twice a week after his wife had a miscarriage. What a piece of work
his behaviour was disgraceful. We're not arguing about that.
I want to come back to this point about his role as a teacher. Most teachers in secondary school also help to guide the young people in their charge on moral matters, and particularly about emerging relationships and emerging sexuality. Most teachers you talk to will see that every day. This is an extra special area of trust. How can he guide other children but regard himself as exempt from it? That's what I find particularly despicable in this case. And he really... I'm delighted he's been banned ever from teaching again. That was the minimum that could happen. I'm particularly concerned about the woman judge's words, because the other thing is no one has talked about the young woman in this case and the support that she and other young victims like herself are going to need. She may have been manipulative, but it might have been a learnt behaviour because she had had something else in the past. We don't know. The point is, she was still at school, she was there to have support and to be able to rely on supervision elsewhere, and if I were her parent, I would be absolutely appalled at her being blamed for this.
OK. All right, I'm going to go on. I'm going to move on to a question that is at the heart of this forthcoming election. It comes from Eddie Strengle, please.
In order to help reduce the deficit, should we tax more or streamline certain services?
Tax more or streamline, by which you mean cut? By which you mean cut?
Not necessarily. Streamlining means cutting out waste, but not necessarily cutting out services.
Tax more or streamline services. Douglas Alexander.
I think we need to do three things. There are going to have to be reductions in public expenditure, but we do need fairer taxation, with those with the broadest shoulders paying more. And at the same time, at a more fundamental level, we also need to run a different kind of economy. We all welcome the fact that we're seeing falling petrol prices at the pumps, but the truth is, anybody with a wage packet at home knows that we haven't seen wages rise over many years. And the truth is, unless we see wages rise in our economy, then we're not going to be able to deal with the deficit properly, because we won't be generating the tax income and we won't therefore be able to support the services that we need. So we've seen a failed approach from this government, which is to cut ever deeper. They're about £200 billion adrift from the target that they set themselves to reduce the deficit. I think it's time to leave behind that failed plan and embrace a better plan. And that better plan does involve, for example, those with incomes above £150,000 paying more. It does, for example, involve recognising that there will nonetheless continue to need to be costs reduced within the public sector. But we've also got to run a different kind of economy. If we don't see rising wages, we're just going to see the deficit stretch into the future, as we've seen over the last 4 years.
Anna Soubry?
I think the thing is, Douglas, you had your chance for 13 years to run our economy, and look at the mess you made of it. And people rightly won't trust you again. And I have to say, I don't think they'll believe you as well when you make all these amazing claims about the things that you will do, because the simple truth of it is, we do have to live as a nation within our means. We're actually taxing people at a higher rate, 45%, than ever we had under 13 years of Labour. So we are also, at the same time, actually making tax cuts for millionaires. I didn't interrupt you.
Oh, you have several times. Why did you give tax cuts to millionaires?
No, but not on this one. Now, please let me just finish. We are having higher rates of taxation of 45% than we did in 13 years. We've taken millions of people out at the lower end of paying taxes. And most importantly, we're restoring our economy. We're putting sanity in. We are making sure we're living within our means. We are cutting the deficit. And we have record levels of employment. We have hundreds of thousands of people now who are in work, taking home a wage, having a responsibility, doing the right thing, and all the other things that being in work does for people. And we have growth in a way that we should be proud of. And if we hand it all back to you guys, we'll be back near the verge of the bankruptcy courts. We've got a plan, and we now need to carry on delivering it.
The woman in the second row.
you say that you've increased employment, but all these, it's minimum wage, it's not a living wage.
Yeah.
It's a living wage, not an actual wage. And you say that there are 0-hour contracts. How do you expect people to get off benefits and be able to work and provide for their families if they are not getting regular hours from their employment?
But the reality of it is that we have hundreds of thousands of people now in work. And I think just simply saying, oh, it's low paid or it's zero contract, and actually... Because we are actually looking at 0-hour contracts. Some people suit them, not everybody suits them. That's why we're looking at... I'm just going to say, sir, that's why we are... I agree with you. For some people... I agree with you. For people on benefit in particular,
what your government is doing
and that is
not
exactly
saying,
what we are
You're
looking
saying
at.
that we put more people in employment, but you've put more people into 0-hour contracts.
But it is better, surely,
which you
sir,
can't
it's
even
better
afford.
to be in work and bring home a wage than sit at home and do nothing.
You can't live. And also, wait, another really important thing is you've got rid of the crisis.
No, you've had your say. You've had your say.
Why did you get rid of the
Sorry,
crisis
take the microphone
loans?
away from him because he's had his say. You have had your say. Well, you have had your say. A lot of other people want to say. David Starkey wants to stay. Briefly, David
He's been very
Starkey.
silent here.
I don't know. It's amazing.
I think well, first of all, can we be quite clear? There have been no overall cuts in government expenditure at all, which is why the deficit is ballooning.
No, not the deficit. Borrowing might have gone up, but not the deficit.
Borrowing increasing enormously.
Not the deficit,
It's
darling. We
virtually
nearly
doubled.
halved it.
It's virtually doubled.
But half the deficit.
Halving the deficit, but borrowing has doubled. What we're doing at the moment is something very frightening. Two things. We've got, effectively, a very, very large National Health Service with a very small and shrinking state attached to it. And we're really going to have to choose. Everything is being sacrificed to 2 or 3 things, to education, to the health service and to foreign aid. All other areas of government, you talked about the police, they're being shrunk. Area after area. Now, do we want this? Is this how we want to run ourselves? Do we simply want to be a National Health Service with a little shrunken willy of a state attached to it? I think no, and I don't think we should. I also think there's something else. I agree with you about jobs. There were 2 problems. The first was Gordon Brown introducing in-work benefits.
Yes,
in other words, this was disastrous. Lincolnshire knows all about this. There was the Speenham land system in the late 18th century by which the state or local ratepayers subsidised the wages of local workers, local farm workers, which drove the wages down and down and down. So that was a disastrous idea. But the second is we've had globalisation. We have deliberately thrown our economy open in every way to countries where levels of wages are tiny, where there is no social security, where people will work for nothing. And we admit their goods essentially without tariffs. I'm sorry, you cannot actually have our levels of wages and social security and globalisation and absolute freedom of trade. In all our ways, our politicians around this table pursue utterly contradictory goals. Nobody thinks, nobody reasons, nobody either looks at the past or takes serious
All right, briefly, what is your prescription then? Taxes up, pay for the NHS? What would you do? Just very briefly.
My prescription is that we have to start choosing. In other words, we stop pretending we can have everything. These people at the next election will all pretend to you you can have everything.
And what would you cut out?
I believe
attacking them. What would you do?
What I would do is I would face up to the truth. I think we're at the point where we probably need to flirt with protection. I'm surprised at myself for saying this. The evidence of the last banking crisis, that it was very largely to do with the free movement of capital. Why are there 0 interest rates? Because places like... Because China, because much of the Middle East, there are gigantic accumulations of capital.
OK.
So we've got to start choosing.
Right.
And we have politicians who will not give you honest choice.
Starkey tariffs. OK. You, sir, over there. Then I come to you.
Just to address the original question about whether we should be raising taxes, surely we should be addressing the issue of corporations such as Amazon and Vodafone completely avoiding tax altogether. and then you wouldn't need to raise the tax. If everyone paid equal tax, you wouldn't need to raise the tax.
You think that would yield enough, those companies, do you?
Not just those two specific companies, but I'm sure there are more than them.
Brinton?
Can I come back?
Starbucks.
Come back where you like.
Can I come back to Eddie's original question, which is tax rises or streamlined services? You can't have an either-or. If there are tax rises, it has to be for those who can afford it, because actually they have got off somewhat lighter.
Not true.
And no, they have.
It's not true.
They have.
David,
the percentage of tax paid by the rich has increased every year.
That is true. It cannot be at the cost of the public services that are essential. And that's why you can have a stronger economy, which the Conservatives keep talking about, but you can't do that if you have to face major cuts, for example, in the NHS, or, as was leaked in a Conservative document last week, they're not going to protect the education. You can't have good, strong
public services unless you've got a good, strong economy.
That's what pays for our services. You can consider what taxes you're going to raise to cover that. So we have said the NHS needs £8 billion extra. There's no doubt about that at all, and we've said that we will find it because that is an absolute
priority. Where will it come from? That's a completely uncosted promise.
Even
not a single fact. Where's it coming from?
It will come from... you talk about the mansion tax. One of the things that
where's it coming from?
We want to do a slight variant on the mansion tax.
How much does it raise?
3 years.
How much does it raise?
It raises considerably more than yours because
we raise $8 billion a year.
The mansion tax is bigger than yours.
The woman there on the right, then I'll come to you, Mehdi, because we're coming towards the end of the programme. The woman in spectacles there on the right.
Have you spoken to Danny Alexander about this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about everybody else, but, you know, talking constantly about the deficit and the sort of economics of things, you know, look at what the actual cuts are doing to people. Exactly. Most public services are down to the bare bones. You know, people, they're hitting the most vulnerable, the hardest, you know, and we've got to protect these people in our society. And managing the sort of economics of the country is not at all like managing your own home budget, as people keep trying to say. It is not. And there is money.
You get the point. Mehdi Hasan.
Mehdi Hasan. Live within our means. George Osborne, your Chancellor, has missed every debt, deficit, borrowing and growth target he set for himself in 2010. George Osborne has borrowed £200 billion more than he said he would borrow in 2010 because he didn't get the growth he needed.
So what would you do?
And by the way, that's not because of cuts. That's not because I'll come to that. That's not because of cuts, as David suggested. It's not because of cuts. It's because of lack of tax revenues from low-paid work, from zero-hours contracts. And you know what's the real scandal? As the lady said there, the real scandal is the costs of all this. Why, in the fifth richest economy in the world, did 1 million people go to use food banks last year? I think that's a true scandal. We want to balance the budget. Don't balance the budget on the backs of the poor. What are the financial sector pay for? Why don't you get the banks to pay for the crash that they caused?
We're coming to the end of the
You gave me the least time, David, so I'm going to make a point.
You
did. You came to me and said I had 30 seconds. I'm using it. Will you better say?
We've restored our
banks.
We've restored our
Bring in a Robin Hood tax.
You know that we have. We've increased employment. We've got growth on the list.
How about bankers' bonus tax?
We've got one of the most successful companies. We've got one of the most successful economies in Europe, if not the world, and we should be proud of that.
And 1 million people using food banks, Anna.
All right, before anarchy takes over. Thank you very much, but our hour's up, I'm afraid.
You're very
Eastleigh. No, don't carry on now.
No, I was telling him he was very naughty. I was being nice to him. No, I was being nice to him.
We're in Eastleigh next week. We've got Diane Abbott for Labour, Esther McVeigh for the Tories, Paul Nuttall, the Deputy Leader of UKIP, Tim Farron for the Liberal Democrats. I don't know who that was for. And the editor of The Independent, Amal Rajan. The following week we're going to be at Wrexham in Wales. So if you can come to Eastleigh in Hampshire or Wrexham in Wales, apply in the usual way. Go to our website. You can call 0330 123 9988. If you're listening to this on 5 Live, as you know, the debate goes on Question Time, Extra Time. But here, well, I hesitate to say the debate comes to an end, because I doubt it does. But anyway, for the moment, we have to stop. My thanks to our panel and to all of you who came to take part here in Lincoln. Until next Thursday. From Question Time, good night.
free speech in the frame with Andrew Neil, joined by Susie Perry for This Week on BBC One Next.